Hello, everyone. My name is Erica Richardson. I am a professor in the English department and affiliated with Black and Latino Studies. And I'm here to welcome you to a presentation or a works in progress presentation about some of my work, such as Aunt Nancy, Gender, Scavenging, and Racial Capitalism on the Harlem Renaissance Stage. Now, before I move into discussing my work, followed by a conversation to help me further develop my ideas, I want to explain that this presentation or this discussion is part of a larger series called Black Futures, Black Studies, Black Ecologies, and African Diaspora. This is a public-facing knowledge project that's been supported by the Provost Innovation Seed Grant and is run by the Black and Latino Studies, Black Studies Colloquium, which features a series of researchers and their students all working together almost on a horizontal platform to develop knowledge about these topics in a way that can become accessible to a larger public. Black Futures began this year, spring 2022, and will continue into fall 2022. And we have a series of programs and content that are available on our main site seen here. And so as you'll see to the left, we've had events in the past, all of which coming by the end of semester, spring 2022 will be posted with YouTube links so that you can access that material, our readings, our student responses. This work will evolve over the course of fall 2022 and yield to a larger conference featuring African diasporic scholars as well. And so with me today, I have wonderful members of the Black Studies Colloquium, as well as researchers within the Black Futures Project, Dr. Angie Beeman and Dr. Rojo Robles. And so Angie, I'm gonna hand things over to Angie for a little bit to introduce herself before I move into my larger project, bearing in mind that these are my interlocutors, these are my friends and colleagues as I am trying to figure out how to move from an idea to another chapter in a manuscript. So now I will hand it over to Professor Angie Beeman.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Professor Richardson. So my name is Angie Beeman. I'm an associate professor in the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. And my work focuses on the conceptualization of racism and specifically racism evasiveness and how progressives engage in racism evasiveness. So my book, Liberal White Supremacy, How Progressives Silence Racial and Class Oppression, is coming out this September 2022 on University of Georgia Press. But I also look at sort of this renewed interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, this renewed interest in DEI and all of these initiatives and the impact those initiatives have, particularly on faculty and staff of color who I think are expected to overcommit themselves to those initiatives. And so who are we ignoring when engaged, committed to that work? Who gets recognized and who gets ignored? So I'd like to say more about our brilliant Professor Erica Richardson, who is an assistant professor in the English department. Professor Richardson is the director of the Black Studies Colloquium at Baruch. She specializes in Black 19th and 20th century print culture, Black women's writing, African-American drama, and the formation of discourses on Black social life. And she's currently working on a manuscript entitled Empirical Desires, Data, Dispossession, and the Aesthetics of the Negro Problem. Professor Richardson was awarded the Institute for Citizens and Scholars Career Enhancement Fellowship, which is formerly the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. And this fall, 2022, she's looking forward to continuing her work on her manuscript and scholarship as the Schomburg Scholar in Residence at the Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture. So we welcome you and thank you very much for sharing this fascinating work.
Thank you, Angie. So I'm now going to switch to sharing my screen. And go to full mode. Okay. Is everything visible right now? I just wanted to check in real quick. Okay. So the title of my talk today is Such is Aunt Nancy, Gender, Scavenging, and Racial Capitalism on the Harlem Renaissance Stage. So to begin this talk, I want to pose a question. In what spaces and by what means can we glimpse Black women's labor beyond the terms of capitalism? In her 1983 classic, Women, Race, and Class, Angela Davis, in a historical analysis of capitalism and housework, argues that women are typically conscripted into housework as a precondition of capitalism. As Davis explains, if the Industrial Revolution resulted in the structural separation of home economy from the public economy, then housework cannot be defined as an integral component of the capitalist production. Rather, it is related to production as a precondition. The idea of being a precondition, as Davis presents it here, is useful for an extended allegorical and material conception of women's labor as spatialized and structurally necessary for production, and perhaps ironically hidden in plain sight of the domestic sphere. Black women's work can be seen, but is illegible as a form of labor and value on par to capitalism itself. So what happens when it is explicitly brought into view, or as I discuss it in this presentation today, onto the Harlem Renaissance stage? How might Black drama and the context of the Black cultural and intellectual blossoming situate Black women's work in relationship to social and economic systems of an emerging Black modernity? Using critiques of capitalism as theorized by scholars in gender studies, Black studies, care studies, and discard studies to critically interpret a seminal play of the Harlem Renaissance, Willis Richardson's The Chipwoman's Fortune, I illustrate how Black women can operate within and beyond the structures of capitalism through transformative labor practices of scavenging and care. The focus on the Chipwoman's Fortune, focuses on a poor patriarchal Black family that is threatened by white economic exploitation, making the play an ideal cultural and ideological formation through which to interrogate the prevailing logics of gender, race, and capitalism. The Chipwoman's Fortune brings us into the poor Black household where Aunt Nancy lives with Silas Green, his wife Liza, and their 17-year-old daughter, Emma. Although Aunt Nancy is not related by blood, she contributes to the household by gathering chips of wood and coal to heat the home, by caring for the ill Liza, and teaching Emma about roots and medicine. All in return for a room. To think further about what upsets this harmonious dynamic, we need an understanding of racial capitalism. And this is also a term that I'm looking to define further in terms of scholarship, but also in terms of the play itself. Racial capitalism, as I'm initially thinking of it, is based on the work of Cedric Robinson, is a process of extracting value from non-white people or people of a less dominant group. This act of racial capitalism occurs in the play when Silas is forced by his white boss to pay a debt to another local white store owner. The white boss and the white record store owner are friends, and Silas's boss eventually realizes that Silas rents a Victrola, or record player. In order to extract further money and exploit Silas, his boss basically demands that Silas pay the money owed on the rented Victrola immediately, or he cannot come back to his job. There is a profound constraint and irony here. Silas's white boss essentially expects Silas to find extra money while he is not working in order to pay the debt. But instead of Silas reacting or responding to his boss and the structures of racial capitalism, he turns to Aunt Nancy. Aunt Nancy, he is sure, has a hidden fortune of money that she's been saving in the woods or out of doors. He confronts her and demands that she take that extra money and give it to him since she does not, in fact, pay rent. In this way, racial capitalism trickles down from the top into the Black patriarchal home and starts to extend or impact the home economy that has been functioning and supporting Black social life. Aunt Nancy admits that she does, in fact, have the money. Oops, excuse me, let me go back. But she isn't saving it until her son, Jim, arrives after being released from prison. So she has the money and would give it if she could, but instead has to save it for another support or another form of Black social life to support a young Black man coming out of prison. By the end of the play, after tensions rise with Aunt Nancy and Silas debating where her money should go, ultimately the play is resolved by Jim's unexpected but anticipated arrival, a deus ex machina. When Jim arrives, he immediately sees the situation and offers Silas the money, who at first refuses out of respect, but then ultimately accepts so that the family may keep its Victrola and so that Silas may return to his job. In my close reading of Richardson's play and related archival material of the period, I aim to demonstrate how the very constraints put on Black women in spatialized and structural terms of the home and places out of doors and in the street poses an intervention in the gendered and racialized logics of capitalism. This intervention posed is most apparent in the agency and striving of Aunt Nancy as a protagonist. In her care work and her scavenging, she transforms discarded items into use and value, discarded people into a part of Black social life that may reproduce. However, even as she does this work and has this transformative labor, it's important to note that the play's plot concludes with two Black men reaching mutual respect, as opposed to Aunt Nancy's labor being recognized as value or her work as contributing to the household as something instead of rent. So my goals today are to further think about the definition of racial capitalism that I'm mobilizing, that I'm using to interpret the play, other questions and considerations and resources I might use, but also how exactly does scavenging and care work transform? And then what to do about the end of the play? What role does masculine bias play? What does it mean that from the site of mass incarceration or the prison off stage, a deus ex machina or miraculous solution emerges? I think Richardson in this play is grappling with the structural and its necessary labor and life of Black women, but also very much recognizing in a realistic format how Black patriarchy and Black masculinism is deemed the ultimate or the sort of paramount way of reproducing Black life and determining an arbitrary value. So let me tell you a little bit more about the historical context surrounding this play and then the figure of Willis Richardson. So Willis Richardson wrote many, many plays during this time period, over 40 plays between the 1920s and 30s, and then over 70 plays over the course of his entire lifetime. That said, in the latter half of his life, the last 30 decades, even as he was producing new plays and circulating them through different Little Negro Theater or small Black theater groups, his work was largely under-discussed and under-analyzed. In my own work, I found out about the majority of his plays by going into his archives at the New York Public Libraries and the Schomburg. I still struggle in the process of even finding copies of his plays, because typically what he would do was have it produced by a small press, and then through word of mouth and often different small theater groups, there would be requests for a copy. he would send often his only copy in the hopes that they would return it, but also that the play would be produced, that the play would circulate these aspects of Black life, but also, as I hope to further develop, educate Black people about themselves and potentially about different forms of social progress and economics. So for example, some of his plays have titles like The Mortgage. Some of them are called The Compromise. In both cases, these plays deal with someone trying to pay for a house or pay for a debt. One act plays deliberating on how do Black people manage their economics or their economic status and wealth. Not only that, for the moments that I could not find the plays themselves because they're few and far in between, there were definitely times where I would have the playbill in his scrapbooks or correspondences, and I would see the list of characters, the small group producing the play, and then to the side, advertisements for taking out a loan in the bank or getting a mortgage as opposed to renting. And so what I hope is that as I develop my analysis of this play, I also extended into the archive to consider how is he actually circulating and promoting this process of economic edification that also features different forms of Black social progress and Black social life. So when I reference the Little Negro Theater movement, this is part of a larger movement that was happening in the late 19th and early 20th century, where there was a shift from the big, flashy, sort of spectacular plays to smaller one acts that could be more easily and like economically produced by small theater groups. So there's kind of this synergy or connection between the focus on everyday life, and then of course, having everyday people actually perform the plays. There's a delicate yet emphatic empirical realism that circulates throughout these works. There's also a focus on the folk, the Black working class or poor, the use of Black vernacular and dialect. And these plays, again, as I mentioned, could be performed by everyday people or amateurs in their homes, in churches and basements, basically focusing on the one room so that it could happen anywhere or happen closer to Black people. And then, of course, be for Black audiences as opposed to the space or the place on Broadway. So here's one of the archival finds that I discovered when looking through his papers. In one of Willis Richardson's scrapbooks, he has a cutout of a photo of one of his plays. I cannot begin to stress how rare this is. While his archives feature many, many sort of small reviews and playbills and correspondences between himself and people seeking the plays or wanting to know more about the plays to read or produce, very rarely are there actually images of these productions, which makes sense because it would have been extended resources to actually have a photograph, especially in this time period in the 1920s. Nevertheless, I think it's useful, or not nevertheless, it's so important to have this image when we're considering sort of the aesthetics and the purpose of the Little Negro Theater movement and this focus on sort of the working class. So at this point, I'm going to leave the image up here for a little while as I begin to read through the text of Richardson's description of the opening of the Chipwoman's fortune. The text reads as follows. The scene is very plain, a dining room of poor colored family. The floor is without covering. The walls are without pictures. At the center of the floor is a rectangular table with a couple of chairs near it. In the rear wall is a fireplace in which a low fire is burning. And at the left of this sits Liza in a rocker. She is wrapped from shoulders to ankles in blankets, for she is just up from a spell of sickness. At the right of the fireplace is a window. A door at the right leads through to other rooms in a backyard. Another door at the left leads to the front of the house. Against the left side near the door stands a Victrola. So with this particular production, we can see that it stays pretty true to the description or the text that Richardson provides. one fireplace, one window, one table, and then sort of the item that elevates or at least indicates another kind of life besides bare necessity, the Victrola, which in this particular scene is probably a final moment because we have two people standing alongside the Victrola, which means it's just getting ready to be repossessed before Jim comes in and has the money in order for it to stay and in order for Silas to get his job back. The sparse home and set establish the materiality of poverty as a kind of iconography. Each object and figure has its place, its presence, and consequently its resonating meaning. The Black home the audience enters is one intended to frame and uphold the poor and working class in their economic condition rather than indict them. Shortly after we're invited to envision this home as readers or as audience members, Aunt Nancy takes the stage as our protagonist and as a marginal figure. So the opening scene reads as follows. Presently, Aunt Nancy appears at the right. Every one of us has seen her kind, those old women who go about the streets, picking up chips of wood and lumps of coal, or searching in trash cans for whatever they can find. Such is Aunt Nancy. She is old and her back is bent on account of constant stooping. She's wearing a bonnet which partly hides her black wrinkled face and is wearing a shawl over her shoulders. Aunt Nancy is a familiar and liminal figure, someone who is in the streets and alleys, yet also someone who emphatically and necessarily can enter the home and domestic space where she cares for the ill Eliza. Aunt Nancy's labor in this way is spatialized and put on stage as being both part of the home yet outside of capitalism. Scavenging involves unsanctioned labor, saving the discarded, searching and roaming. She's not a woman at home. She's not a woman in her place per se. And because she has this transgression, I argue she's able to transform, to pick up the discarded and turn it into value. An act that Marissa Solomon refers to as laboring waste, which involves changing how it is valued and how it is used in stories of betterment and progress. And so to create a parallel to our own moment, I think about how there are times where people call the police or sort of make these claims or refusals of having people go through their trash or pull out the cans. The act of scavenging and turning something discarded into value, while we can recognize it as necessary, it also connotes a sense of criminality or being on the margins. And that is the very space that Aunt Nancy navigates in order to change her story and the stories of those around her from one of liminality or criminality or sheer sort of deprivation into betterment and progress. I also like to think about Aunt Nancy as a caretaker because that's also central to what she contributes to the home in exchange for rent. So I'm not going to read this scene entirely at length for the sake of time, but I do want to note that early on, Liza is sort of lamenting that she's sick, but getting a little bit better, all under Aunt Nancy's care. So Liza, the wife, says, "I'm glad something good's happening to somebody. Ain't nothing good happening to me." Aunt Nancy replies, "You getting better, ain't you?" "I'm getting better." "That sure is good. And besides, you're young yet. A lot of good things can happen to you before you die." "I hope so. Let me look in your eyes. Your eyes are starting to shine. You'll be getting all right pretty soon." She whispers something in Liza's ear. "Oh no, ma'am, Aunt Nancy." "That's all right. You wait. I like to see a woman's eyes shining. It shows she's got some life in her. I don't like to see no woman with dead eyes, especially young woman. I like to see them pert." So in this moment, especially signaled by the language of blushing, there's a suggestion that not only is Liza getting better, but she might in fact be pregnant. I suggest this because of the shining, the sort of looking at her face. All this connotes with the idea of a woman glowing once she's pregnant. There's the prospect of life as a result of Aunt Nancy's care. And building upon this, I'd like to think about Leah Lakshmi Pyamsin Shamarasina's work, Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. She writes, the thing about being working class or poor and or disabled and or parenting and or Black, Indigenous, or brown femme is that people are going to ask you to do stuff for them. Oh, are they ever? They're going to ask you to listen, do a favor, do an errand, drop everything and go buy some cat food or crisis counsel them, manage logistics, answer feelings, emails, show up, empathize, build, and maintain relationships. Organize the childcare, the access support, the food, be screamed at, de-escalate, conflict resolute. Some of them will be people who are close to you. Some of them will be total strangers. Do you have a minute for free, forever? And you know what's going to happen? You are going to do those things because you do indeed care, because it's the right thing to do, because you're good at it, because you want to. And because your life, sorry about that typo, as a working class or poor or sex working and or disabled and or Black or brown femme person has taught you that the only way you or anybody survives is by helping each other. No institutions exist to help us survive. We survive because of each other. This is the logic, imperative, and set of values that motivates and founds Aunt Nancy's actions. And by using these ideas from care work, especially as they detail and add complexity to the work of care, we can further appreciate how Aunt Nancy is transforming through her work and through her labor. And while this is an idea that I'm still developing, I often think about how Aunt Nancy is old as well. So she's not a bright young, well, she's a bright woman, but she's not like, pert per se. She's not like fully bodied or fully able-bodied in the sense that, her back is stooped. She is old. She is working these streets, and nevertheless, she's going to do this labor. And this is a common sense logic or common sense that many of us understand and perceive within the homes of Black and brown people, and especially Black people. The idea of Big Mama, Grandma, she is part of that home economy. She is the necessary thing that ensures life, but also ensures that other people might be able to go to work. Silas's job is furloughed, but the only reason he's able to go to his work, at least the underlying warrant, is because Aunt Nancy is taking care of Liza at home. Emma further brings this up, or further emphasizes this, Emma, the 17-year-old daughter, when Silas begins to say she has the money, she should give it to us. So at the beginning of the scene, Silas says, yes, she has got the money too, and she'll have to pay some or get out. I don't see nothing fair in that. She picks up chips, she brings home wood and coal, and she nurses Mom. What more do you want? If she'll give me a few dollars or let me borrow a few dollars, maybe I can go back to my job tomorrow. If you put her out, I believe Ma will go right back to bed because there won't be nobody that'll know what to do for her. So I don't see nothing you'll gain by putting her out. As I walk through these moments and recognize the conflict that Silas brings into the household, I also want to emphasize the conflict he experiences as a part of racial capitalism outside of the household. The two spaces are integrated, but nevertheless, there is sort of this gendered separation, or at least this gendered separation as far as Silas sees it, between his struggle and the struggle of Aunt Nancy. I'm not going to read this entire scene at length, but I do want to highlight how he understands and perceives that his manager, or the manager of the music place, and his own boss are friends and both invested in getting the most money possible out of Silas. Silas, instead of confronting them, which is a potential option, but a very precarious one, considering the lack of resources and the lack of sort of ways that Black people can actually push back against racial capitalism, especially in the context of the 1920s. Silas turns to Aunt Nancy. Now, something I found fascinating when I teach this class is that my students often say, well, why can't he just let the record player go? Why can't he just give it back as opposed to losing his job or extorting this additional money from Aunt Nancy? The Victrola has a set of symbolics that are associated with the bourgeois or middle class, and it's literally the nicest thing that this family owns. It stands out, signifying their right to entertainment, leisure, and rest from work. It's an aspiration to rise. And so even as there's a sense of why hold on to this Victrola when Aunt Nancy is doing this work, I think it would be remiss or dismissive to just put this desire to maintain the Victrola aside. What Silas is grappling with is material, but also is symbolic, and it's about a sort of aspiration for life or affirmation of his own family and what they have a right to. I also like to bring up this question of what entitles Silas to Aunt Nancy's money. And this is when I start to think further about the way racial capitalism infiltrates Black patriarchy. Aunt Nancy's money is outside of capitalism. She's scavenging, it's unsanctioned. It's literally outside the home. So it's not in the domestic space where we usually sort of recognize, or it's not purely in the domestic space where we usually recognize women's work. She's out there scavenging in the streets. And then also, why is she doing all this? She's doing this for her, as Silas puts it, her jailbird son. So she's doing everything outside of all the norms of citizenship, of home, and of capitalism. So again, this is the scene that I get the jailbird quote from. And immediately, Silas's response is, you aren't given money to any jailbirds. So in addition to losing liberty, supposedly for criminality, which is very complex as I get further into why Jim was put away in the first place, Jim is an entirely dispossessed subject, and he's not entitled to any of his mother's care, any of the money. Excuse me, not Silas, Jim is dispossessed. And in this respect, like we anticipate, or at least I anticipated in my initial reading, that there would be immediate tension between the two men. But ultimately, when Jim does arrive, there is mutual respect and recognition between the two. Maybe this is in part because Jim immediately offers the money and says, here, you can use it. And Aunt Nancy also sort of acquiesces to whatever Jim ends up deciding. So she basically moves from one patriarchal authority, being Silas, to another, her son. But in this case, the ties are by blood, they're much closer. And then overall, she's redeemed for caring about multiple figures and constantly sacrificing, which is also a problematic conclusion, because how much can Aunt Nancy give? Is her entire sort of purpose predicated or being honored here because she always gives until, like, you know, the close of the play? She gives until we assume she can't give no more. So with this point, I come to the conclusion of my talk, and the sort of the conclusion of my, or at least my initial grappling with this chapter. What does it mean by the end of the play that we are back inside the structures of capitalism and patriarchy in spite of the transformative actions of Aunt Nancy? What does this play teach, protest, or highlight about the folk? And then what do we do with Aunt Nancy? Is this a moment of just refortifying the same structures that Black people live within? That is one possible way of looking at it. But what I'm trying to sort of apprehend and further theorize and interrogate, both in terms of capitalism, race, and gender, but also within the aesthetics of the play, is what can we glimpse when we bring her into view, when we have her on stage, in spite of the final conclusion of the play. And so with that, I will stop my share and open it up to points of conversation, observations. I give a lot of different questions, and those are just the ones I begin with, but I actually deeply appreciate questions that like originate from your own responses, because this work has mainly lived in my own head. It hasn't had a space with an audience. And so I'm very flexible and intrigued to know what struck you, and what things you would like to follow up or learn more about. And maybe I'll like hand it over to Angie first, since she is my moderator.
Sure, I do have some questions. Thank you, first of all, for that lovely presentation. This is not a play that I was familiar with before, and we had talked about it, but I just love how you analyze it through these themes of racial capitalism, Marxism, and Black Marxism, and gender, and in using Angela Davis's work. But I was wondering, what do people, because those are themes that are, I think, very controversial, even within so-called liberal academia. And so there's two things. First of all, I was wondering, in your discussing this film or this play with your colleagues and presenting it, what do you find that people tend to focus on with this play, and what do they tend to ignore? So are there certain themes that get extra scrutiny, like maybe over intellectualized, and some themes that get ignored? And then the other thing, given that your work addresses racial capitalism, Marxism, and Black Marxism, do you receive any resistance to this work? And maybe your interpretation of the work, and when does this occur? Does it depend on the audience? Does it depend who you're presenting to?
Yeah, these are excellent questions. So most often, like when I've shared this at conferences, and I'll also say like when I shared in the space in my classroom, because I do actually think my students can they reflected similar points as my colleagues and other scholars, where there was a lot of, people were like, oh, of course, Aunt Nancy does anything for her son. Of course, this is all about sort of maintaining the Black home through the figure of like a Black patriarchal figure, because in times of precarity, the most valuable thing / person is going to be a Black man. And I don't refute that, but I think it's interesting that it's almost a concept or that doesn't get interrogated or sort of pushed at as it fits into larger structures, such as Black women's labor and capitalism. Last time I spoke with colleagues about this play, the first response is always like, oh yeah, like I think I've read that. I know it's the first one that was produced on Broadway. I have to look more into the history about why it's the first one produced on Broadway. It was only for like a few months, and I strongly suspect it's because it participated in the sort of little theater movement, and Eugene O'Neill, like it caught his attention as well. So that's why through his review of it at a smaller theater, it eventually made its way onto Broadway. But most of the time when people read the play, they read it as if, and this is something I'm deeply interested in, as if it is an extremely realistic reflection of Black life, and therefore not necessarily questioned. And this, especially this facet of the esteeming or sort of prizing a Black son and maintaining Black manhood, it's advanced even further in the play by the fact that Jim was in prison. Like the mass incarceration bit, like I still haven't fully figured out what I think about it, because it's sort of maintains its presence within the last couple of pages or the last couple of lines. And here's like something I didn't talk about within the presentation proper that makes it even more complicated. Jim is in prison because he was dating a woman or seeing a woman who had a husband who found out, and he beat the both of them up. And so like it's explicit that, especially not in Nancy's dialogue, that he beat up a no good woman, and that's why Jim is in prison. And so this idea of sort of the precarity of Black manhood, and the necessity of protecting and maintaining that in just a few lines that are often cast away, is brought to this like tipping point of like, who do you choose? Like, it feels like a gendered conflict, not only between Aunt Nancy and Silas, but also within like the history of the characters within the play. And that's something that my colleagues are like, oh, that's part of the masculinism of this play, but it's all about maintaining the morality, or not the morality. I should contextualize that more. This play is all about emphasizing the morality and the importance of Black people working together, particularly Black men working together against white men who are working together. So that's the primary interpretation, like these two interracial pairs being able to like battle one another. But what I hear less about is the sheer fact that this play is called Aunt Nancy's, like the Chipwoman's Fortune. Like every line in the title indicates or gestures to something outside of that sort of centralized conflict that gets discussed the most. And when I teach it in my African-American drama class or in the Harlem Renaissance class, my students always say, that's how we know this play is old. And I'm like, I should have followed up on that. I'm like, what does that mean? Like, that's how you know this play is old. Like, also the other day, someone was like, yeah, the Harlem Renaissance was 100 years ago. I was like, oh, that's accurate. So those are sort of the pre-existing like discourses, but nobody really goes into the economic philosophies or systems that are at stake within the play. And I do think it's in part because of the genre itself. Like, this is supposed to be about the folk and paying homage to Black life, but somehow that is deemed as not sort of matching up with these kinds of conversations. And it in short, which I have not done, but in short, people are like, I think you're reading into this a little too much. And I'm like, I don't think so. Like, it's just, and even if I am, how fruitful a conversation emerges when I do so. And that's the end of my very long-winded answer.
Thank you. I wanted to invite Rojo as well to see what comments he might have or questions.
Yeah, thank you, Erica, for the presentation. This play is new to me, and I'm really like interested, right? Well, the points you presented like really make me want to read it and engage more with the work. I want to say also that I was really interested in the idea that you presented at the beginning of Black women labor within and beyond capitalism. And I was thinking also like from beyond the play, right? I was thinking also to what extent, if you consider like to what extent Willis Richardson himself is also like working within and beyond capitalism. And when you bring the context of how the play was written and produced, I see like something similar, right? Like, and this whole like dynamic of giving away the plays that you mentioned also, that I feel like it's kind of like, and this idea also like performing in small venues in people's home kind of like goes against this theater as an industry, right?
Absolutely.
And this idea of also like using community spaces such as churches also, so it's a theater that is more oriented to actually not to it's not oriented towards capital, it's more oriented toward community building, I will say. Or that's what I understood. But maybe like how like this plays also, like if we consider the figure Willis Richardson and his theatrical practices, to what extent those two things match, yeah, these characters who is within and beyond capitalism, but himself being within and beyond capitalism. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think this like turn to the biographical and the extent to which like Willis Richardson is participating in the kind of practices that he also seems to be emphasizing, or at least literally putting on stage, as something I've been thinking about a lot, especially because like quite literally, it's very difficult for me to get his plays. Like they're in such small production. And my initial entry has been like finding select digital archives, very, very select. Like to the point where it's like, I'm not entirely sure how I get the copies of some of his things, which is also my own route outside of capitalism. But in addition to that, it's like, I ended up reading all these letters that he wrote to people, like some 75 letters I went through, where he mentions so many things that he either got 10 copies of or published in this small press and that small press. And like, he's also had interactions with CUNY. Like I've been trying to figure out where this former library of, or this former anthology or archive of Black plays and Black writing that was created in the 1970s towards the end of his life, using correspondence with a CUNY professor. And the name of that sort of institution, which escapes me right now, but it's also like the name has changed. And so in that like archive or in that letter exchange, I see the professor write like, please don't send us another of your last copies, because it's like, we want a copy, but we don't want the last one. So there's also this anxiety about the archival impulse. Like we want to save it, but we need to make sure there's more than one saved. And then there's like this question of resources. I think there's a way in which Richardson is so invested in this community theater project within production rights. So in that, exactly what you're saying, the cost of royalties, getting access to a copy of the play, printing the play. As prolific as his work is, it always seems to be running out. And there is the kind of parallel to Aunt Nancy. As much as she can give, it also seems like it's an extraction that reaches a point of deprivation that we never quite arrive at. I feel like I don't know. It's like I'm now mixing metaphors because I'm thinking of some mathematical term where it's like everything gets really close to zero, but it doesn't actually arrive. Similarly, it's like Aunt Nancy doesn't like, she always has something else to give, but it's not out of an amass of wealth or resources. It's out of her sheer precarity. And similarly, Richardson, as prolific as he is, through this creativity and ingenuity of his, it's running out. And the testament or the final evidence of the fact that that practice runs out is that the archival or the archive itself is bereft. And so this is actually really helpful because I'm so glad you posed this question, because I've been trying to find a way to, because I have to anticipate, I may have to create a bridge between Richardson's archive and the play itself that functions on what I have, as opposed to getting copies of all these other plays, because I don't know if it's going to happen. It's like, that's the risk of archival research. You don't know if you're actually going to find it. I don't know if I'll find what happened to with this 1970s CUNY professor who was gathering all this like Negro literature, and I don't know where it is anymore. And the name of the institution, which again, I wish I had it on hand right now, it's like it's changed. It's now like a technology center, I think. So it's like, oh, well, what happened to that box of papers? I believe he was situated at City College, but again, like it's all about that trace. But I think especially what you were saying, or another point I want to bring up, is how community itself is not distinct or mutually exclusive from our processes of figuring out what to do with resources, figuring out like the nature of capitalism and exchange and value itself. Like actually community and creativity is deeply intertwined, and maybe theater itself is like the cultural formation and the practice to help us further understand how these things are in fact deeply integrated, even as, in our disciplines, we tend to separate them out.
Yeah, and in this case, you mentioned like care work, and I feel like there's a level of care work in this, in his insistence of keep writing, keep producing plays, but within this limited, not necessarily profitable atmosphere, right? And also without that archival drive that you're describing. So it's more about the immediate moment of building community, of creating like a space for Black people to develop their own narrative, their own like representation through theater, right? I wanted to also like ask, I really love the question that the students pose, like this idea of why he can let go of the betrothal.
Yeah.
And I love that question because it's a key question. Yeah, and definitely like the way you interpret it, I feel like it's very important to contextualize this idea of the betrothal as an object that is also representing an aspirational economic level, for the character, and this and the idea of middle class and all that. But also, I was thinking to what extent also like it is a very, I don't know, because I haven't read the play yet, right? Maybe this is something that is within the play, but maybe you can expand on it. This idea also like to what extent the betrothal is a desire for recorded sound, right? And I'm thinking about like this also about like the popularity of jazz records during the 20s, and the fever for jazz records during the 20s, and to what extent it is also an affirmation of Black music, right? And Black sound, this idea of owning and having a direct contact with Black sound, with the recorded Black sound that was happening at the period, right? So there's an economic aspect that I definitely see, and I agree with you, but to what extent also that other level is there?
No, I absolutely agree. And it's like, I have to think more about this, but immediately I consider how the 17-year-old Emma, she like wants a new record to play. Like that's what she's first talking about when she comes downstairs. And at first, and again, this is why it's like so great to talk about with my students especially as we develop like a recursive practice of like going back to reading and thinking about it again. Because at first everyone was like, oh, you don't need that record player. You don't have to have that. And I was like, have you ever had something in your house that was completely like an indulgent spend that the whole family like really enjoyed, but wasn't necessarily like a smart thing to buy? I was like, I definitely remember a time where it's like we got a computer. Not one of us really knew how to use it. Like I remember Oregon Trail when I was like 5, but it's like you had to have it to show that you were part of what I would suggest like an evolving sense of like modernity. And so when you're speaking about Black sound, I mean, this is your participation in Black modernity in terms of culture, but also in terms of technology, like thinking about the fact that you know what something sounds like. This is something shared by others, and you can bring it into your home. And it's like, it's sharing an experience, not unlike sharing the experience of theater itself. So it's tough when you're like, are you going to have like your Victrola or a woman who's caring for your sick mother? You know, and that's where, you know, that material value and investment and desire that I think is very much embodied or associated with the figure of Silas as like the patriarchal figure or the male figure taking care of the home. It's associated with him, but it's not. What I want to do is like, even as I critique the Black patriarchal structure as it unfolds, I don't want to suggest that Silas's desire for that material is gendered. Like it's very actually relatable and like easy to understand, like why you want to keep the one item in your home that shows that you are not just getting by. or just sort of
mhm,
putting food on the table. It's like you have a right to entertainment, to leisure, to other ways of
mhm, mhm,
self-expression in life that go beyond that work, come home, sleep, eat, and go back to work model. But that being said, it's like, and then I keep coming back to my same question of,
mhm,
I'm sorry, my other item is like, I need to put this on mute. But it kind of brings me back to my question of like, what do we do with like Aunt Nancy? Like
mhm,
and I don't know, I think it's something about my desire for narrative endings that makes me want to completely reconcile everything that I have to sometimes
mhm,
like let go of. But I thank you so much for bringing in sounds, because that's another way of thinking about how this play, even as it focuses on figures we may not associate with Black modernity, nevertheless
mhm.
participates in it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I actually, I see a friend of mine that's in the waiting room, so I'm going to admit them and also say hello. Although I do think I might be wrapping up a little bit. Any other questions or comments, Angie?
I just wanted to follow up on that, the students and other people's reactions about why this item has to be kept. And I really appreciate how you discuss this as sort of having a right to leisure and right to free time. And
Mhm,
that kind of reaction when I talk about economic inequality and poverty and welfare, it's a similar kind of, and I have students make these budgets and talk about what they can, just to make a basic budget. There's this sort of the idea of what they think that they don't need, or what poor families don't have to have. And
Mm-hmm.
it just shows this internalization of capitalistic ideals, that in this sort of moral interpretation of work, that it's all about hard work, and if you don't have the money to meet your basic needs, then you can't, none of these other things matter, that poor people don't have a right to anything that goes beyond those basic needs. And it reminds me of, and this might be some work that you might, in some empirical studies that might actually be useful in thinking through these ideas, but Making Ends Meet by Eden and Line, and how they interviewed these women, public assistants, and their definitions of motherhood that were
Mm-hmm.
at odds with how they were, that good mothers don't just put food on the table. They don't just care for their children's basic needs, but it also to them meant treating their children, even if that meant, as Aunt Nancy did, sacrificing giving up what they could have, whether it was food that month, or sacrificing their own health care and taking care of themselves in order to treat their children. And so it's just these ideas that we have of the poor. This is why I asked you about your colleagues as well, because, I think for a lot of folks in academia, many people are coming from, not all, but many people are coming from privileged backgrounds. And I think that, those of us who have more working class backgrounds, we're more we have different kinds of challenges, even navigating this field, and are sort of in touch with some of these ideas that seem sort of abstract. And I know I've come up against that in my own field, and getting people to understand the intersections of racism and class oppression in a way that doesn't whitewash one or the other. And I think that has to do with having close ties to people in my family who are on public assistance, and close members of my immediate family. So it's that I think often just the way that those inequalities are kind of embedded in the institutions that we're navigating as well, and how that impedes conversations.
Yeah, I also wanted to say the resource you were bringing up in relation to that about like Black maternity, it's really useful to me, and immediately making me think about how Black maternity is featured in this play, and sort of all the stages that are perhaps like the least sort of like iconic or symbolic. So for example, it's like, like big pregnant belly, holding baby, holding a small child, like that's typically like the forms of maternity that jump out to us the most. But in the context of this play, maternity is a woman's eyes shining, an old woman saving money for her older son. And then I would also say that I didn't mention within the course of my presentation, the character of Emma, as the moment that Jim arrives, Emma is 17, which like within the context of any play is like, oh, just young enough to be romantic, or just young enough to be like girlish and like draw us in. But at the same time, like you're on the cusp of womanhood. And of course, we know your womanhood will be soon to arrive if you're in fact looking for a partner. So she gets kind of shy and a little skittish. She doesn't, it's all in the stage directions. It's not actually in any of her dialogue. So it's very, very subtle. But she's looking at Jim like, oh, new man that is in the house, and he'll be familiar because it's Aunt Nancy's boy. And I say all this to say, like, we often actually understanding maternity, and especially Black maternity, as being an action, and as being sort of an action, but also something that like very much depends on, and maybe this is something we do know about, but further to consider in the play, an action that depends on the nurturance or something that extends from the maternal body itself. Whether it's like Liza being sick, but the eyes shining, she needs to get better because there's a hint that she might be pregnant. And then of course, everything that Aunt Nancy does, that is entirely a testament of maternity. Maternity that it extends to her own, but also beyond herself and to this family that is not hers by blood, which is the very point that like patriarchy loves to insist upon. You are not blood. Like that is the thing that keeps Silas from further sort of recognizing what is value and what is labor and what is being exchanged by Aunt Nancy. He cannot see it because of the bloodline. Aunt Nancy operates outside of those bloodlines because of her maternity, which is kind of, it's an interesting flip. Or maybe that's how maternity or matriarchy, I should say, actually critiques patriarchy. It's not necessarily all about the blood, but maybe it's about the nurturance, and what that actually entails. My concern is that Nancy never stops giving. And so I think part of me, especially as I think it's a larger scope of my book, even as I want to emphasize and affirm her actions, I'm also critical of them because I'm like, you know, it's not that you want to care for your full-grown son. It's just that that same full-grown son, you care for him so much that that no good woman that he got involved with, she deserved to be beat up and you did not deserve to go to prison. That's where I like have this, and this is why the play, and I feel like nobody ever talks about that ending because of this very reason, because we can no longer sort of absolutely glorify what Aunt Nancy does when we start to consider not just that she cares for her child, but what she ends up upholding in the process of doing so. And I'm like, oh, like whenever my students read it, it's like, wait a minute. So what are you saying? Like Jim beat a woman up and that's why he's in prison? And it's confusing because that's the exposition, that's the backstory. When he shows up, he is a grateful son, a respectful man, and immediately willing to help out like a fellow like brother and family in need. And it's like, all right, what is community is being built, but like there's some things that's being built upon that we cannot fully esteem. And it's like, I'm like, I'm like, what do we do with that? And so that's like another point that I have to, and this is why I say like the play itself, but also Willis Richardson's archive is rich enough for a chapter in my larger project. But I'm still working through how to think about a series of tensions that go unresolved, at least within the context of the play. Like, what does that tell us if they're never fully resolved or not, like, you know, meeting, I would say, my own liberatory politics. I glimpse something from Aunt Nancy, but she doesn't get us out.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
And so much of what you're saying about the care work and how the women's care, how Aunt Nancy's care is being overlooked here at the end in that controversial question, and what's getting ignored, and what we're paying attention to. We definitely see that within movements today, and who is starting these movements, the movement for Black Lives, the Me Too movement, and other movements that Black women are leading and caring for Black men and all people, right? Everybody is benefiting from that movement. So I didn't know if you want to, you said your friend has arrived. I don't know if you want to welcome them before we.
Hi.
Other...
I appreciate you being here. And I know you probably don't want to be on camera, so I'll leave it at that. But I'm glad to see a familiar name. I swear I'm in the office sometimes. But yeah, I think I actually will conclude a bit with this point, Angie, because I have not fully worked this out for myself, but I do know within my larger project, I am thinking about the modes or the formations of Black social life and the types of Black modernity that are brought into view or argued for through a series of archival materials during the Harlem Renaissance, especially as they relate to political economies and social data. And it sounds strange, but it's one of those things where I hope with this particular project to take this archive, take this play and my analysis and critical interpretation and sort of theorization of it and bring it to the kind of data or documents that comment on what Black employment or Black labor and social status looked like in this time period. So like quite literally, I'm hoping to move from this place of this place where I see the literary and cultural production actually commenting on and interpreting the realities of Black social life and Black social progress and political economies, and compare it to what happens and sort of the documents that say, here are the numbers, here are the employment rates or the lack of employment, here are all the things that are kind of objectively or empirically wrong. Because I do, or are wrong with Black people, that's the full statement. Because I do think Willis Richardson and his attendance to all these details and the sort of realism of Black poverty is trying to do something with what we know to be the state of things, or what people in their own moment, in this moment, would have been like, yeah, like I know it's hard out there. It's hard to get a job. It's hard to keep it. I don't know why you want to push back against any white employer. All those things are there, but like what happens when we take those narratives, especially as established by objective and empirical documents, and compare it to the literary transformation and interrogation that happens within the work of someone like Richardson. And as I've been doing this, I started this as a dissertation project where I was writing in the context of the ascent of, and the rise of Black Lives Matter. And I have not worked it out yet, but I do know there is an underlying Black Lives Matter methodology that is informing the way I'm interpreting these works, or maybe even the implications of these works as I engage with them. So like hearing you bring up that point when I didn't even say it at all, because it's so, it's like, it's tenuous, but it's still there. Like it's tenuous, but irreducible for me. The fact that this is the context, or that was my context as I was working with and beginning a lot of my work on this material. So that says something to me, that you reach that place, even though I don't, and then there's also like that anachronistic sort of, or not anachronistic, that disparity in time. I'm focusing on 1890s, 1920s, 1930s. But I still know on some level, I'm also commenting on a social movement that happened like within my own lifetime. haven't worked it out yet, but it's very inspiring and affirming to me to hear someone reach these ideas as well.
And that's why these old plays, as your student said, that are 100 years ago,
they're 100 years
so
old.
And why it's so important and so relevant. And if there weren't certain pieces of the play that made that obvious, or if they didn't have the date, they might not be able to guess the time if it wasn't for, you know, certain elements of it, right? If we wouldn't give them the date, would they think if it?
Yeah, it's like what parts would be, I mean, it's like there's some sort of specificity of language, but like the context itself, the plot itself. I mean, even as they said this play was old, they're also like, yeah, I also know that, like, you know, Black moms love their sons. And I'm like, what does it mean that this is like this circulating, like, kind of common sense or like just kind of folk knowledge that we still have today? Even as we have, you know, our sensibilities and understandings of gender and whatnot, it's like, but yeah, no, Black moms will do anything for their sons. And I'm like, it works on so many levels in terms of how we think about this and its implications across different systems of thought. But yeah, I will sort of bring things to a close there, because it's just very exciting, because I'm like, oh, the thing I didn't say, we still got there. Don't know what to do with that, but still got there.
Good.
Yeah, go for it.
So, and your work is I put in the chat that your work is in conversation with so many interesting fields. I love how you brought up our good friend Marissa Solomon's work on discard studies. I think that's so fascinating. But, you know, care work and work on political economy, Cedric Robinson's work, Angela Davis, Black feminist thought, it just speaks to the power of this work. So I just wanted to, I'm going to stop recording if that's okay with everyone. And I want to thank you again.
Goodbye, and thank you for watching if you end up watching.
And thank you again for sharing this work with us.
Absolutely.